While many aviation analysts have relegated Boeing to third place at best in China behind Airbus and Comac, and even with Airbus's CEO Gil Foray recently saying that the Chinese aircraft manufacturer Comac may soon disrupt the dominance of Airbus and Boeing, even going as far as suggesting that the sector could go from a duopoly to a potential triopoly. But what if I told you that the demise of Boeing in China, especially its 737, is not imminent at all? As a matter of fact, Boeing is as strong as ever in China. And also, what if I told you I can show you the data that proves that Boeing, and especially its 737, will not only remain a huge part of the Chinese market, but continue to thrive in China? Fake news, you say? Maybe you think I'm a bit optimistic, or naive perhaps. Well, get ready, because I'm going to explain why the demise of Boeing's 737 domination in China has been greatly exaggerated, and why Airbus and now Comac need to be aware that Boeing, especially its 737, is still a huge player in China's massive aviation sector. And that's next on Maximus.
You are watching Maximus Aviation.
Greetings everybody, Maximus here. Okay, so a quick history reminder. For the first 50 years of commercial aviation, only one aircraft manufacturer dominated the aviation world, and that, of course, was Boeing, hands down. But then around 1972, Airbus arrived on the scene. To be sure, it didn't happen overnight, and it took them a while. But eventually, with the advent of their new fly-by-wire, side-stick, computer-dominated avionics, first seen on the A319 and A320 series, well, pretty soon the aviation world had what we've come to know now as the duopoly of Boeing and Airbus. And that duopoly not only dominated the free world, but communist Red China as well. So over a few decades, China began to grow into a superpower. Oh, and a superpower that you and I helped to create by buying their cheap electronics over the years, but that's another video entirely. However, in the 2000s, China said, hey, we can't have this. We need our own plane. So they stole one. They decided they wanted to build their own aircraft to challenge the duopoly of Boeing and Airbus. And thus, the Comac was born. Comac, of course, standing for the Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China, which is solely owned and operated by the Chinese government. But even though the Comac was built, well, not built as much as repurposing about 90% of stolen or reverse engineered Western technology. Well, anyway, suddenly Comac is proving itself to be a contender and is coming after the duopoly. Oh, and when I say the Comac was stolen, it's a fact. However, this video isn't about that. That ship has sailed. But just Google stolen Comac and you'll be off to the races. But it is what it is, and we are where we are. But regardless, now China is hoping to sell their Comac to customers outside of China. And by outside of China, yes, I mean the entire world. However, China is finding that to be a much bigger task than they planned. Meanwhile, back in the West, Airbus, unlike the US, which seems to have a better grasp on the dastardly deeds of the Chinese, and for good reason, they prefer to keep their manufacturing here at home. However, Boeing's rival Airbus, well, they have set up shop with 2 manufacturing assembly lines in China with plans for more in an effort to replace Boeing as the historically dominant airline in China, especially since Airbus has already snatched that position from Boeing throughout the rest of the world. Plus, add to that the on-again, off-again trade relationships between the US and China, and of course, lest we forget in 2019, the extra-long grounding of the Boeing 737 in China after the MAX disasters. Oh yeah, and a little thing called the pandemic, all of which devastated the Boeing-China relationship. Still, regardless of what you're hearing from aviation experts, I'm going to tell you why. Not only will Boeing in fact remain dominant in China, but at the very least will remain a fierce contender in the Chinese aviation sector. So in the power vacuum left by Boeing during its recent years of turmoil, we've seen the rise of China and its partnership with Airbus, with the hopes of using their homegrown Comac aircraft to either replace or minimize China's reliance on Boeing and its workhorse 737. However, on closer analysis, and thanks to the folks over at Seeking Alpha where I found some of this information, it appears that Boeing and its 737 may still indeed have a very bright future in China after all. Okay, so before China grounded the MAX in 2019, there were a total of 95 MAXs in service with Chinese airlines. And let there be no doubt that there was a political motivation for China's intentional decision to be the last country to allow the MAX to return to service, not the least of which centered on Taiwan and trade tensions between the US and China. So for China, keeping the MAX grounded until early 2023 was a no-brainer, and the reason was as simple as it was convenient, because due to the pandemic, demand for air travel was at a historic low, and it wasn't until that demand began to return and China was starting to feel the pinch of fewer 737s that China started easing the U.S. trade restrictions. And that's when the Boeing MAX jets were finally recertified in China. However, that extended grounding also enabled Boeing to exert some pressure of its own on China by remarketing 120 MAX jets that were already built for China. So when China saw that Boeing was serious and began offloading their previously ordered 737s, well, that forced China into recertifying the MAX much sooner than planned, to be able to cope with the high pandemic travel demand while also trying to salvage access to previously ordered airplanes that remained in stock. However, the first step for China, as well as Boeing, to meet the post-pandemic demand was to get all 95 Boeing MAX planes back in service. So then the next obvious step was for the remaining jets Boeing had not yet reallocated, getting them to China. And the first step in that process was initially expected to be completed in the first 6 months of 2023. And indeed, most of the jets were reactivated by mid-2023 as planned. However, it would take until November 2023 for all jets to return to service. Additionally, that delay enabled Boeing and Chinese carriers to prepare for the completed jets in storage to be delivered. So by the start of 2024, there were 85 MAXs ready to be delivered to China. Initially, the deliveries were expedited quickly. However, due to a U.S. congressional visit to Taiwan in the summer of 2024, much to the dismay of China, of course, well, that pissed off China once again, so the delivery pace was halted as a result. Then again, in August of 2024, the pace of deliveries picked back up. But then yet more disruptions arose due to the Boeing machinist strike and work stoppage, which added yet another delay in the delivery pace. So fast forward to January and February 2025, when a total of 9 airplanes were delivered. This brought the number of deliveries to 59. However, by the end of 2024, 40 airplanes were still in the U.S. waiting to be delivered. So as of nowish, in the spring of 2025, around 30 Boeing MAXs are still awaiting delivery to China. And those deliveries are part of a backlog of airplanes Boeing has to ship to reduce its $83 billion inventory to get its production and delivery schedule back up to speed. So as of the end of February 2025, there were 154 airplanes in service with Chinese operators, of which those 154 airplanes made over 250,000 flights and nearly 700,000 flight hours. Also, the newly delivered airplanes are gaining share in the total flight hours as well. Currently, that share stands at nearly 18% and 26% measured from the point when deliveries restarted in February 2024. Or to put it another way, the new deliveries allow for a whopping 35% growth in the total number of flight hours for the Boeing MAX in China, and that share is poised to rise even higher. Additionally, utilization of the MAX in China has sharply improved since the reactivation of the fleet, and there is still much more room for growth. And that growth can only come as a result of new Boeing airplanes being delivered. After the MAX was grounded in China, some investors had thought that China would never take deliveries, or at least not as many single-aisle deliveries from Boeing. However, in fact, quite the opposite is true. China has been gobbling them up. And why is that? Well, because Airbus and China's Comac simply can't meet the demand. However, even if both companies could meet the demand, there would still be the enormous task of retraining Boeing 737 pilots for an entirely new aircraft from a different manufacturer. So while the current general view is that Airbus and potentially Comac are eating Boeing's lunch in China, as well as other markets, the reality is that in China, Boeing shares and deliveries are holding up very well. Also, over the past 12 months, Boeing was picking up the pace too as they delivered 48 more jets directly to Chinese operators. So that gives Boeing a 47% share of single-aisle deliveries over the past 12 months. 47%. I'm the Weinstein, but that's almost half. This provides yet another indicator that China is continuing to attempt to balance deliveries between Boeing and Airbus. So it's very obvious that China needs airplanes to support further growth of air travel, because it can't squeeze any more juice out of the fruit they already have. However, even if Airbus had the ability to deliver the backlog of aircraft, which they do not, because Airbus has been backlogged for years with unfulfilled orders. It's a good problem to have, but it's still inefficient. So what conclusion can we draw from all of this information? And I know it was a lot, and hey, if you stayed with me, let me know down in the comment section. Well, for one, China remains a strong customer for Boeing. Although Boeing is not yet where it needs to be in terms of recovery, the improvement continues to gain momentum, thus allowing the company to reduce inventories and ramp up production. Both of these factors will positively impact the company's financials as well. However, there are some challenges as the trade situation casts a shadow over Boeing, but generally China continues to accept Boeing airplanes because they need them. Also, lately investors have been making a big deal about Boeing being excluded from the market because Airbus has an assembly line, actually 2 assembly lines in China. However, the numbers show an entirely different story. Of course, that story could face some setbacks if a trade war were to erupt. However, it's also important to note that as troubled as the relationship between the U.S. and China has been, China has continued to take delivery of new Boeing 737 MAX jets since air travel demand rebounded in China. So absent a major global macroeconomic setback, Boeing will continue to deliver airplanes to China. So how about that? Some really encouraging news for Boeing and in China no less. So you see, I don't always bag on Boeing. Old Maximus shows Boeing some love when they deserve it. And on this occasion, I'd say they deserve some love. But that's just me. What are your thoughts? Are you glad? Are you mad? You don't care? Let me know down below. And until next time, as always, yeah, this is Maximus.